Basically, this was the first election under the new constitution, which ushered in a totally new system of governance, as you all know. There were many great hopes invested in this process. There had been many preparations made, huge amounts of money spent, laws changed, institutions revamped, restructured. Some of them, for example, the Electoral Commission was basically disbanded and re-established. So a lot of work went into trying to build confidence in institutions which had formerly lacked confidence, which had led to the crisis of 2007, 2008, which we often refer to as the post-election violence. So there were great hopes invested in this process, and as Njonjo said, a high level of confidence in institutions like the Supreme Court, given the sort of thoroughgoing reform processes that were instituted by the Chief Justice, Willy Mutunga, and indeed the process of the choice of the Chief Justice and the other justices had given rise to a great deal of hope. So it was somewhat disappointing that we were subjected to a somewhat messy, to a very messy electoral process characterized by many failures despite the huge investments. And civil society documented the pre- and actual election and the post-election period. And we published our findings, we monitored them, just as we did this year. In 2012, 2013, we published the Ready or Not series. We published very many analyses, wrote very many statements, sent many letters, most of which were not responded to by the officials that we addressed them to. And indeed, the Supreme Court presidential petition wasn't the first time that we were engaged in the legal process, even during the elections. If you remember, when agents and observers were thrown out of the National Tallying Center, and the IEBC proceeded to count, to tally the vote without properly referring to the foundational document, which was Form 34 at the time. This is our 34A in 2017. And the Form 36s were not consistently being verified. We went to court, to the High Court, to try and stop the process. And while the court recognized that we were raising weighty issues, they basically told us that we had to go to the Supreme Court because that's where everything affecting the presidential elections belonged. So after the announcement, the declaration of the results, civil society put together an extraordinary largely volunteer effort. We had only 7 days to do this, and we basically had a team of varying people who came together. Lawyers contributed their pro bono time. They worked day and night, sorting through the mountain of flawed election documents. Technical whiz kids, PhDs, political scientists, constitutional lawyers, journalists, scholars, very young students, basically just fresh out of high school, contributed their time in terms of assessing the documents. And we put together a case which, compared to the resources and the battery of highly paid lawyers who appeared for the other side, including using our taxpayers' money to hire extremely expensive private lawyers, such as the chairman of the IEBC and the IEBC itself. Compared to that, this was a largely volunteer effort, and the lawyers that did get paid basically earned a pittance that those high-level lawyers, high-powered lawyers who appeared for the IEBC would have sneered at if we'd offered it to them. And you see their names being raised once again in terms of who's going to represent the IEBC and the other respondents. And this is a process which I think we need to document, but given that we're under such pressure, we often don't document our successes. But I think this was a high point in terms of civil society engagement around the elections. So why did we go to court? We noted during our monitoring that there were numerous cases of errors and misconduct, including non-transparent procurement of materials, uneven distribution of biometric voter registration kits across the country, meaning that some regions were favored in terms of how they were registered to vote, already introducing a bias in the capacity and the access to the vote. There were significant shortcomings in the voter register, with very many shifting totals in the voter register. We did not have a single final principal register of voters in 2013, and I think we'll probably argue that we do not have one in 2017. There were the inadequate opportunities for inspection of the voter register by voters in 2013. Deadlines were shortened. The IEBC fell behind in so many things that it had a knock-on effect on the entire process. And we saw this again, even though the IEBC had 5 years to deal with the problems experienced in 2013. We saw again the very same litany of failures in 2017. We had chaotic party primaries, and party nomination dispute resolution procedures were also questionable. The failure of the electronic voter identification and electronic results transmission systems was a further failure, which I think we can say was repeated again. And there was a failure by key players to systematically audit or monitor the work of the IEBC, for example, political parties who did not take their responsibility to actually audit and inspect the voter register, also through their own failings, but because the IEBC did not facilitate this. Neither did they do this in 2013, nor did they do this in 2017. Indeed, what we were being given as, what we were being offered as an inspection in 2017 was merely the opportunity to verify your presence in the register and the correctness of those details. We argue that the comprehensive inspection, which would have given parties the comfort that they were dealing with a clean or reasonably clean. We're not asking for perfection here because we won't get it. But the sort of openness and access that would have allowed parties and other interested people to inspect the register comprehensively, this had to be forced through a court decision and only happened very late, and it was an extremely difficult and cumbersome process. Then there was the questionable role of the National Tallying Center in producing a final count. And we would argue that despite the court decision which made the constituency level the final place where results are announced, we again saw the IEBC claw back on this provision and defy the courts. The post-election dispute resolution procedures were quite troubled. We're focusing on the presidential election dispute procedure in terms of the Supreme Court decision, which will be addressed by others. I'll just speak to the experience of civil society. And we argued to the court that the conduct of the 2013 presidential elections was overall not free, fair, or transparent. It was not administered in an impartial, efficient, accurate, and accountable manner. The electoral management system was not simple, accurate, verifiable, secure, accountable, or transparent as required by the Constitution. And we said the counting and tallying of votes was neither open, accurately collated, or promptly announced. And neither were the appropriate structures or mechanisms to eliminate electoral malpractice put in place, including safekeeping of election materials, contrary to various provisions of the Constitution. And the petition outlined a range of shortcomings starting from the voter register as the cornerstone of a credible election. We looked at shifting totals of the register over time. We looked at additions to the voter register after it was finalized, and different numbers of registered voters at different levels of the elections, governor, president, MCA, etc. The forms contain different numbers of registered voters. We also saw that the expensive electronic systems which had been acquired in order to secure the election spectacularly failed. The electronic transmission of results, the EVID, the electronic voter identification, all of these measures intended to protect the integrity of the vote by preventing multiple voter registration, multiple voting, or ballot stuffing, erroneous tallying, and other irregularities. All of these expensively acquired equipment failed on voting day. And I think we Kenyans are engaged in a sort of upward spiral of increasingly expensive elections, procuring increasingly expensive and elaborate technology, which completely collapses when it's actually put to the test. We saw that laptops failed, people forgot their passwords, and there didn't seem to be some sort of contingency for them to recover their passwords, so that the control mechanism of the Form 34 results being transmitted by phone to the National Tallying Center and to the constituency, that failed. The electronic results transmission system failed and produced misleading and an incorrect tally of votes. If some of you remember, the ERTS, electronic results transmission system, failed quite early in the day, but oddly enough, the results recorded in some of those cases was higher than the result actually produced at the end of the day, which would seem totally illogical. And so once again, we find ourselves paying all sorts of money to secure our systems, and these systems keep failing. So I think we need to start looking for where the real problem is. It doesn't seem to be in the systems. The IEBC did not ensure that voting was conducted using accountable and a verifiable system. As I said, there was no tallying and verifying in the polling stations in the cases where systems collapsed, which again was against the Constitution. And as I mentioned before, agents and observers were excluded from the National Tallying Center on the pretext that they were being rowdy when there were protests about perceived failures and irregularities. So there was no credible tallying or verification. There were problems with the forms. There were so many irregularities on Forms 34, the original polling station document, our today 34A, 35 constituency level, and 36. And these irregularities affected the validity and the credibility, the outcome, results, and declaration of the election. And strangely enough, we saw that the electronic results transmission system was generating a vote count with a consistent gap. Many of you will remember the graph we published. We tracked the results announcement on a spreadsheet and turned that into a graph, and that generated completely parallel lines on a graph, which would seem to be very odd if you're having results being randomly relayed. And of course, most of you will realize that I'm referring to what happened again this time around when this ticker tape on the television was producing a constant stagnant difference between the results of one presidential candidate and the results of his main challenger. So again, we seem to have repeated the errors of the past. Again, we had a problem of irregular procurement. You're all familiar with the phrase chicken gate to refer to the scandals around procurement of electoral equipment last time, where electoral officials who were colluding with a UK company, printing company, referred to bribes as chicken, giving rise to very many jokes about people with drumsticks sticking out of their pockets, etc. So I don't know what they called themselves, what they called their bribes this time around, but I expect then another addition to the Kenyan lexicon of corruption, similar to Goldenberg, Anglo leasing, etc. So irregular procurement. Tender was awarded to an unqualified bidder in 2013, and again we had problems with the procurement, leading to pushing back of deadlines, for example, in printing of ballots, etc. In terms of technology, it also emerged during the petition. Evidence was presented that a server hosted by the Kencall company was used both by the IEBC and the TNA party. I no longer remember what TNA stood for. I don't think the people who founded TNA remember what it stood for either, so I don't think it needs to detain us. I think in earlier incarnations they've been called PNU, TNA, etc. So at any rate, the political party and the Electoral Commission appeared to be sharing a server, and allegedly registered users for both databases were the same. And the databases featured a manual override system which allowed users from both databases to see and alter results. We'll learn whether the Supreme Court made any finding on this very serious allegation. This was also interesting because in a grand gesture at the beginning of the case, the Chief Justice ordered that all Form 34s be re-scrutinized. This rapidly dwindled down to, I think, 18,000, and in the end, about 22 polling stations were scrutinized. So we saw the Supreme Court sort of not coming out very much better than the IEBC in terms of the scrutiny of the results. What was ordered was a scrutiny of Forms 34 and the Forms 36, the polling station and the constituency level tally forms, the process was supervised by former Chief Registrar Gladys Cholet. Now, the verification should have focused on the numbers of votes cast, valid votes, and rejected votes. But the methodology used was unclear. The registrar's report did not include any of these figures. And the Carter Center, which this year has been so complimentary of the conduct of elections, found that the exercise was of limited value to the court, and it could not identify where in the court's judgment this information had, where the information had contributed to the court's judgment. And I should, while I'm dwelling on the subject of international observers, mention that in 2013, you remember that there was what we call the peace mantra, that there was such a concern about a possible repeat of violence that all dissent and critical scrutiny was delegitimized in the interests of peace. And we also saw the international observers coming out and saying, well, there were a few irregularities, but on the whole, the will of the voter has been respected. Oddly enough, the Carter Center was similarly complimentary, but sometime later had to walk back its complementary assessment, and therefore it's a bit puzzling that they would rush to so quickly and prematurely deliver a clean bill of health for the elections. And so we wonder if they will now be forced to walk back, given the results given the developments after the elections, whether they'll be forced to walk back that very, very positive assessment of the elections, them and others. There were very few exceptions where observers said this is preliminary and we're still observing the process, and therefore, while we say that the election day was conducted in a very credible manner, we are yet to observe the rest of the process. The IEBC then in 2014, April, released what it called final results. It took that long to release what it called final results. And our analysis, if you're interested, there's a small booklet called Not So Final on the table there where we analyzed the IEBC's purported final results. And they had much less information than the previous results in terms of rejected votes, objected to, disputed, valid votes, etc. They only had valid votes, and they did not have polling station results. So complete results of the 2013 election were never announced, and as in 2007, 2008, Kenyans did not know what had happened to their elections. And we wonder if this will be repeated as we now move towards the Supreme Court presidential petition. I'd just like to highlight some findings that we've made as we've been analyzing the forms that we've been able to obtain and comparing them with the verbal announcement by Chairman Wafula Chebukati and also the results published on the IEBC portal. And we find that as of August 19th, 2017, there are at least 3 different sets of Kenyan presidential results. First, there's the Chairman Chebukati's verbally announced results, which include county-level valid votes cast for each presidential candidate, along with county-level registered voters. Second, there are the results displayed on IEBC's portal, which include valid votes, rejected, objected to votes, and disputed votes for each presidential candidates. These results are available at polling station, constituency, and county levels. Third, there are the results documented in Forms 34B, that's the constituency level results, which include varying pieces of information. All of the Forms 34B contain polling station level valid votes cast for each presidential candidate. Most of them, but not all, include rejected votes for each candidate, total valid and rejected votes for the entire constituency, and total registered voters for the constituency. And few forms contain the information on rejected, objected to, and disputed votes, so we're comparing different kinds of information. And it's important to note that these results include important and unexplained differences. In fact, the verbally announced results, results verbally announced by Chairman Chebukati, do not match what is in the portal as of August 19, 2017, in any single county. When comparing what was verbally announced with an aggregation of constituency-level Forms 34B at county level, the 2 sets of results match in only 4 counties. Also, results in the portal and in Forms 34B match in 1 county. So results contained in the portal and in the Forms 34B match exactly in 1 county. Overall, then, there's a serious discrepancy between the officially announced presidential results and all other sources purporting to contain these results. To date, the source of numbers in the portal and in the announced result remains unclear. It is also significant that there is emerging evidence of multiple copies of Form 34B, each with different totals. There are various cases of different amounts of copies of Form 34B of the same Form 34B, each with different totals, and this happened in 2013 again. And since these multiples bear IEBC stamps and signatures, it is also difficult to identify which version is the original and true form of Form 34B. And we have a much more detailed analysis, which I won't go into, but we'll be releasing that very soon.